Welcome to This Must Be the Place. I'm your host, Alo Galinsky. Each week, I'll uncover what's happening in Sonoma County, diving into the hidden gems and quirky corners. I'll be interviewing some of our local legends, as well as people you didn't know you need to know, all through the eyes of a craft beer enthusiast living in wine country. Join me as we explore one sip, one story, and one adventure at a time, and together we'll find out why this must be the place. Our guest today is Rick Goldsmith, a veteran documentary filmmaker with nearly a 50-year career built on telling stories that encourage social engagement and participation in the democratic process. A two-time Academy Award nominee, his acclaimed works often focus on American journalism and social issues, including the Oscar-nominated films Tell the Truth and Run, George Seldes and the American Press, and the Peabody Award-winning The Most Dangerous Man in America, Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. His most recent film, Stripped for Parts, American Journalism on the Brink, completes a trilogy on the subject of journalism and examines the corporate stripping of local newsrooms by hedge funds like Alden, Globe, and Capital. A member of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, Goldsmith's mission is to use film as a political lens to question the world around us and inspire action. Rick's film, Stripped for Parts, will be screening on Sunday, January 11th from 1:30 to 4:30 p.m. at the Ner Shalom Synagogue in Katati, followed by a discussion panel featuring local journalists Carl Molesworth, Laura Hagar-Rush, and Troy Naday. Welcome, Rick.
Glad to be here.
I'm really excited to have you on the podcast. This is going to be a great way to kick off the new year, talking all about your new film and a little bit about your take on journalism and where it's at these days. I wanted to start by talking about your biography. It reads that you're trained in architecture, music, and community activism. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about your early interests and how they led you to filmmaking, and how they also have interest inform your work today?
Well, you know, when I was in college, I went to Rhode Island School of Design, and I was in the architecture program there, and I was trying to find my way. I mean, this was the late '60s, early '70s. We were all, I mean, my whole generation, we were trying to figure everything out, what to do about Vietnam, whether to serve, whether to protest. In short order, I never finished that architecture program, but it did kind of tickle my nerve of creativity and what I needed to do with it. But I wouldn't get into filmmaking again for another probably 7 or 8 years. I went around, I worked in community activism. I grew up on the East Coast, went to school in the East Coast, and then I came to California and got involved with the Berkeley Free Clinic and other community events. So I was, you know, on the edges of political activism, community engagement, community organizing. And I also had this art background and creativity background that I wasn't really making use of. And at a certain point, I said, let me look at that. Where is my future? So I was in my late 20s when I got into filmmaking. I took a summer class in the basics of 16 millimeter filmmaking, which was filmmaking was film, you know, on strips of of celluloid as opposed to video back in those days. And that's how I got into it, and I never turned back.
That's an amazing story. And we've talked to a couple other guests on our podcast over the last few months that it seems like a lot of people who are involved in the arts as a career, be it a band leader, a symphony orchestrator, or a filmmaker, always start somewhere else and then find themselves into that passion a little bit later in life. I kind of went the other way as I started as a music major. And while I still employ music in my day-to-day life and have a passion for it, I'm no longer pushing for a career in the arts. But these things always stick with us, I think.
Yeah, well, you know, music was part of my background too. My mom was a professional musician, and she taught me guitar, and I still play and sing, and that's part of it. And you know, that fits in with filmmaking too, because the filmmaking process this itself is kind of a musical or rhythmic process in putting together, you know, editing, putting together a piece that people are going to watch. It has to have a certain rhythm, cachet. It can't just be prose, if you know what I mean. There has to be a little poetry in there as well.
And there's all different types of filmmaking. We'd love to hear, you know, how did you get interested in the documentary side of things? Was that your first foray, or was there a path into documentary making for you?
I think that was really the beginning. I mean, I was influenced by the great dramatic, you know, Hollywood filmmakers, going back to Alfred Hitchcock and people like Costa Gavras, who did a lot of political documentaries in the 70s, and people like Coppola and Spielberg and Scorsese, the people of the filmmakers of the 70s and moving forward really influenced me on storytelling. But I also had that political activist background, and I felt like my métier was really in the nonfiction world.
Sure.
And I started that way, and I did have maybe some opportunities to go into the dramatic world, but I stuck with what I knew, and I don't regret it.
Well, that's good. It's good to not regret the way you went into, and I'm sure it's a process to learn all these different ways of making documentaries. What role do you think documentary films play in society and culture today?
Well, it's interesting because my latest film has to do with journalism and what's been happening with journalism, starting with newspapers in this century. The business model went away, and newspapers started to decline. And along with that fallout in the journalistic world, the documentary filmmaking form started to fill the gap in some ways of social problems, social issues, political issues that were being covered less and less in the press because there were fewer people to do it. And the documentary form, even though our business model doesn't work too well either, but there were enough people in it that they saw that, hey, we have something to say because we are the storytellers. The storytellers, like I say, were less and less in the press and more maybe in the filmmaking world, and specifically in the documentary filmmaking world.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. And, today's viewers, it's all about short attention spans, polarized media. People don't like to read or watch something for very long at all. How do you see the role of long form documentary filmmaking evolving?
Well, I think that long form filmmaking, I think filmmaking in general still has a place in our world, and it is the one place where you can either go into a darkened theater or into your den at home and your widescreen TV and sit down for 2 hours, hour and a half or 2 hours, and watch something. And it is a different form that I think even amongst young people, the newer generation who are used to this fast paced, on your phone, 30-second clip type of thing, there's a place for people are still drawn to that long form.
Right.
So I think it's still valid, and I hope it continues to have a long life, whether it's in the theaters or even at home. I think if the theaters can survive, that would be a great thing.
No, absolutely. I mean, I still love going to the movies. It's transportative for me, being able to get lost in somebody else's story, be it the characters or the filmmaker that put the movies together. And as you're saying, there must be a place for this. We're here called This Must Be the Place. So maybe we'll rename this episode for all intents and purposes. There must be a place for filmmaking and journalism just for the week here.
Yeah, well, I agree with that.
So coming up as a filmmaker in your late 20s into your early 30s and beyond, are there certain people or other influences out there that influenced your work? Were there other filmmakers that you drew on for inspiration?
Well, I think the ones that I mentioned just a little while ago were it. Most of them were from the dramatic world, which I guess all filmmaking is storytelling. The documentary form has many different aspects. If you took 100 documentary filmmakers, they'd probably have 100 different styles and approaches to it. But it is storytelling, and I think the great storytellers in fiction have a lot to teach us and a lot to teach documentary filmmakers. You have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. You have to grab a hold of an audience in a way that you're emotionally touching them. You can't just tell them a story. You can't give them facts. That's not what documentary filmmaking is
Mhm.
about. It has to be a communication between the filmmakers and the audience.
And I heard a really great quote the other day where people are often interested in not so much the what you're doing, but the why behind the what. And I can imagine that rings very true for documentaries in particular.
Absolutely. I mean, my career, again, you talk to uh, any documentary filmmaker and they each have a different story. My story is that I look at the world around me, what's affecting me personally and what's affecting my community, maybe politically. And then I tell personal stories that have political and social context to
Sure.
them. I go after them. None of the films that I have done has somebody come to me and said, "Hey, would you do this film? You seem to be the director who could do it." No, they've all originated from me or from me. Sometimes I've had a partner on the film.
Well, how do you balance the desire for artistic flair or your personal style with also grounding in the facts and the research and truth telling? It must be a delicate balance.
I don't think of it so much as a balance as different parts of the recipe. When you have a subject, I'll take this last film. I read an article about an uprising in Denver, Colorado, from newspaper men and women. It was the Denver Post was owned by a hedge fund, and the hedge fund was destroying the newspaper. And the editorial writer took it upon himself to write an editorial blasting the owner.
Mm.
So, what that said to me was, this is a great story waiting to be told. I need to find it. So, what is part of finding that story and telling that story? To me, the obvious places to start are with the people, with the guy who wrote the editorial, with the people that the editorial was based on, with the journalists who were protesting on the street, everybody involved in the thing. So you make those phone calls, and that's your first step. You do that research. What happened here that you might be able to find out from a newspaper article or some other form, and then you start to weave these different elements together. So it's not so much one or the other. It's like a salad, I guess, or
Sure.
like any dish. You have to figure out what are the important parts, what's the right amount of each, and how do you put them together so that they're going to say to the audience what you want to say, and as I said before, reach them, touch them emotionally.
And to further the analogy here, I'm sure there's also some temperature checking going on. You know, what's going to resonate, what might not resonate, and how you're able to keep that all in check.
That's right. You have to look at the time that you're making the film, and you have to envision, especially documentary filmmaking. I think all filmmaking has a certain amount of lead time. It's not like doing the news where the news happens in the morning and you're telling the news in the afternoon.
Right.
No, something's happening. So in this case, what I just told you about this editorial, that was written in the spring of 2018. I was 5.5 years working on the film. So, among my other challenges, I had to say, what's going to be relevant 5 and 6 years after my kickoff event? How has the newspaper world changed in those 5 or 6 years? And have it still speak to the audience in a way that is relevant.
I hadn't even thought about that, how you're doing these real-time events and researching things that are happening then, but then having the production of it come out so much later. It's fascinating to think about a documentary and putting together a film from that angle.
Yeah, yeah, and that is a challenge. Even historical documentary. There was a filmmaker. What was her name? Dee Reese, I think, was her name. She said there are really two time periods that are important for a filmmaker. She was making a feature film, but I think it applies to documentary film. You have to be true to the period that you're looking at. In her case, it was the 1930s. And in my case, when we did a film on Daniel Ellsberg, who exposed, what we call the Pentagon Papers, we were making the film in the 2000s. He did his work, in the early 1970s. So you have to be true to that time period and tell the story of that time period. But you're telling the story to an audience that might be 50 years later, or 30
Right.
years later, or 40 years later, or in my case, maybe 5 years later.
Right.
So you have to be telling to them, knowing what the context is that they are living through at the moment,
Sure.
as opposed to a generation ago. And interestingly enough, even within the distribution period, we finished in 2023. We rolled out the film immediately afterwards, so that was October 2023. And certain things were relevant then. In January of 2025, we got a new president, a new administration. The attacks on the press were, some of them were the same, but some of them were like totally different.
Sure.
The press was the enemy of the people now, according to the administration. So it turned out that since the beginning of this year, there's even more interest in the film
Right.
because more and more people are sensitive to the fact that journalism really is on the brink and we need to defend it. It's such an important part of our life. So there's more and more people interested in the film now than even when we finished the film.
Which must be a great boon for you to realize the poignancy of a story like this coming out now at a time when it really is as relevant as we're all seeing it played out.
It's a boon, I guess, but I always say, fortunately and unfortunately, it's very relevant. It's
Sure.
more and more relevant today, and the unfortunate part is what's obvious, that things are more serious now. The film is on public television now. Ironically, getting onto public television at the very moment that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting has been dismantled.
Ironic indeed. Now, what type of stories do you believe make a great documentary, or perhaps what's the best content for a documentary in your opinion?
I don't think there's one content. I think that with any filmmaking, you have to have a story that touches people. I always tell, like, if I'm speaking before a class of filmmaking students, I say, don't make this film for your 100 closest friends.
Right.
It's too big a thing to do for such a small audience. You do this for mass audiences, and mass audiences means you have to have a subject matter that many, many people, it doesn't have to be all of society, but that many, many people would be interested in watching. And then to me, the key ingredients are to have things, people, events that are interesting to watch, interesting to listen to, that people want to be in the same room as the people on the screen. And then ideally, you want a story that has a beginning, middle, and end. And that's up to you as a filmmaker, what that beginning, middle, and end is.
Now, your films do often tackle politically charged subjects, social justice issues. What is it about these topics you are drawn to? Is there anything that makes them particularly juicy material for your documentary style storytelling?
Well, I think there's two things. One is like, why do that? Well, I think why address social issues? It's because this is the world around us. And in those years when I was struggling to find my voice, find my place in the world, I indeed was trying to find a place for my voice, a vehicle. And filmmaking seemed to be the right place for it. So that's one answer. The second answer is the content itself. And when you have conflict, when you have, sometimes it's good and evil, sometimes it's just conflict. And you also have the development of maybe your main character or your key characters, or there's an event that's playing out. You have some sort of movement of starting at one place and ending up at a completely different place that is inherently interesting. And it's the story of great literature, great drama. I mean, it goes back to Shakespeare, it goes back to the Greeks. It's what drama is about. Starting in one place, going through a change, and taking the audience with you.
Absolutely. And two of your previous films, Tell the Truth and Run and The Most Dangerous Man in America, they both focus on these individuals, George Seldes and Daniel Ellsberg, respectively, who spoke truth to power. Is there some sort of common thread you see in these subjects that particularly resonates with you personally?
Well, I think I am drawn to people who speak to truth to power, who are risk takers, and people who risk, not just risk takers in the sense of like somebody bungee jumping or something like that, or physical risks or climbing Mount Everest. But to me, it's people who take risks for a purpose, for a grander purpose. You brought up those two films and the protagonists in each of them. George Seldes being a newspaper man who had covered World War One. That was, when he was a young man in his 20s, and Daniel Ellsberg, who was involved in the Vietnam War, both in kind of promoting it, helping to shape it, and then protesting against it. And it wasn't until later, well after the second film was done, which was on Daniel Ellsberg, that I realized there was a phrase that both George Seldes and Daniel Ellsberg had used in different contexts. War is murder. And it kind of encapsulated, to me, kind of the greatest, maybe, social protest and the greatest problems in our human condition, which is somehow we have evolved as a species that goes to war and kills en masse other people in our same species. And I think that we're the only living thing that does that. And what better story to tell is to try to move us away from that paradigm so that we're not slaughtering each other and murdering each other. As the two men said, war is murder.
That's really powerful. And what a coincidence that they both have that phrase in common with each other.
Yeah.
Now, talking about your latest film, Stripped for Parts, American Journalism at the Crossroads, it concerns the death of local news and newspapers. How did you get interested in the subject, and what made you think it would make a compelling subject for a documentary?
Well, I've been reading the newspaper since I was 7 years old, which is actually a small part that's in the film. And I just think that newspapers have been such a part of American life, for at least 200 years, going up to the end of the 20th century. And slowly that started to change. So that in itself was, a social political happening that needed some attention. And then you have these journalists who are doing something about it. I mean, think about it. Journalists are taught not to write about their own profession, not
Right.
to write about their own industry, but to look at the world around them and write about that or comment on that. And here they were becoming part of the story and at the same time educating the public about what was happening to a key institution in America, and I think in any society, which is the industry of telling stories about what's happening, news.
Sure. And it seems really powerful to me that they're immersed in it as well. You don't often find, as you said, these writers writing about writing and themselves and journalism, but to be in the thick of it while reporting on it is a different angle altogether.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the other thing that was so great for me was that I got to them right after this, at least the Colorado journalists, and it happened again with journalists from Chicago and from Baltimore. I got to them when they were in the midst of the fight. So they were passionate. They were engaged.
Amped up.
Yes, they were amped up. And what more could you ask for than people who were excited about the very thing you're trying to make a film about?
That's great. I mean, to have that passion shown through is probably just a really great, happenstance, for lack of better words, to be able to make this film around that.
Exactly.
And as you dug into it, were there core questions that were emerging for you about our society, journalism, capitalism, and if any, did you find any answers during the filming?
I think there was a big learning curve for me in what was happening today in journalism. Yeah, I mean, I think the first big question was, what are we going to do about this shrinking profession of journalists, seemingly shrinking profession, of seeing shrinking opportunities for journalists? There's just as many people out there that want to tell stories, that want to cover the news, that want to be a journalist, as there were a generation ago. But those opportunities are going away. One of the big things that I think I started probably understanding at the beginning of the project, but my understanding grew as I went through the project, was that the business model that up until the beginning of the 21st century was not even questioned for newspapers, because newspapers were a place that wealthy men, they usually were men, could go into and put money into it and make more money, as well as providing a public service. And at the beginning of the 21st century, that started to change. No longer could you make gobs and gobs of money and provide the public service. And so you had hedge funds that didn't care about providing the public service. They found a way to extract the money out. And the people that wanted to provide journalism, the public service, with a business model in place, the business model had gone away. So you had that, and we do have that conflict right now and that contradiction. So what are we going to do to keep the public service and still make it viable? And that's the dilemma that we are faced with at this moment. And I think younger people especially are starting to figure it out, because they are starting to figure out, how do my peers get the news? What's the delivery thing? What, and this thing, we're finding out how outdated, in a way, newspapers are. A terrific vehicle for a couple of hundred years. And suddenly, because of a half a dozen things that I won't go into now, but reading habits, Craigslist, advertising, all these things.
Not podcasts, of course.
No, I think podcasts are kind of benefiting from the change.
Sure.
They're the automobiles to the end of the horse and buggy, system. You're understanding that we have to look beyond a business model, just a business model,
Right,
to make this thing work. We have to make it work in spite of the fact that we don't have a business model. And to me, one of the remarkable lines that I came up against in my filming was sitting a billionaire down in front of my camera, the first billionaire I've ever interviewed, who was involved in trying to pull the rug out from under all the global capital when the Tribune Company was for sale. And he was in Baltimore, and the Baltimore Sun was part of that sale. His name is Stuart Bainham. And he said to me, without any prompting, he shook his head and he said, "Capitalism is broken." And to me, what a great line to put in a movie coming from a billionaire. I mean,
absolutely.
You get, got some left-wing rabble-rousers saying that. That's one thing. But
And that's going to spark conversation.
Exactly.
And one thing I wanted to ask about audiences who are watching your films and listening to us right now, how can audiences, or perhaps even journalists themselves, how can they get involved in the fight to save local news organizations? And as you're talking about, combat the vulture capital model you detail in the film.
Well, I think on the local level, that's where things start. And that's where they should start. People say all politics are local. Find out who's doing the news reporting in your community. Chances are there's a new news organization, or three of them, or five of them, that didn't exist 10 years ago. And it might be a digital startup. It might be a public radio station. It might be a combination of both. Find out who the new players are. listen to them or read them. And if you like them, support them because they need our help now, especially with the demise of, public broadcasting on a national level.
You're bringing up so many good points here. And one of them I wanted to touch on real quickly when you said you have to go beyond the business model, because I'm somebody who's worked in the beverage and hospitality world for the last 15 years, and that world is evolving so much too. Of course, with COVID and people's dining and entertainment habits changing and dollar spending changing, but all these businesses out there are figuring out how do we get people in the door, and they're being forced to evolve. And I see a lot of parallels right now with the way journalism's going and journalism media. And I'm also noticing it in ways because I'm an avid newspaper reader. I always have been. And I'm starting to see, these sports writers that I've followed for a long time, perhaps not just reporting on sports, or the entertainment authors going out there and doing more than just entertainment, maybe some lifestyle or neighborhood reporting. And obviously, whether they're being asked to or being told to, going out and finding these new avenues to make themselves more versatile.
I think we are in terms of the journalistic world, we are in such a period of change that how can people plug in? Never have there been more opportunities to change the institutions, the delivery systems, the organizations that bring you news and entertainment and opinion. Never has there been more opportunity than now. It's as if somebody, was putting together some sort of collage and they just threw everything up in the air and
Right.
it's starting to filter down. So how can people get involved with discussion? I mean, there are more and more discussions, and there will be in the screening of our film about what do we do here in Katati about our local journalism. Get involved in those discussions. There is been there. I think there's never been more of a interaction between journalists and community members as there are now, because it used to be journalists reported, community members did their thing. And now they're kind of by necessity finding ways that, hey, we have to work with each other if we are to really provide the public service that we all need to exist and thrive as a community.
Absolutely. No, that's really important about the community aspect, having that dialogue open and finding those ways to just keep the dialogue, to start the dialogue and then keep it open and flowing. Now, before we wrap up here, I want to get back to talking about Rick Goldsmith. I want to ask you a few questions specifically about challenges you faced as a documentarian and your Academy Awards. So why don't we start with the two Academy Awards you've been nominated for? Why don't you tell us about the experience about that nomination process?
Well, I can't lie, it was a thrill. It's only an award and it's a peer award, and we shouldn't get too bent out of shape. This is the season right now where people are deciding on the Academy Awards. But in those days, 1996, 1997 was actually in March 1997. I knew my film was up for possible award and was waiting to get the phone call at 5:30 in the morning. And the phone call never came. And I got my 3-year-old off to daycare and was kind of cursing under my breath. And then when I came to work, I happened to work at the Seldes Media Center in West Berkeley, where Fantasy Films, Seldes, a great producer, was. And they had just been nominated for 12 Academy Awards for The English Patient. And I was greeted by somebody who saw the names posted by the elevator, and he congratulated me. And I said, "What are you talking about?" Because I figured I didn't get it. And he told me, "Yeah, you're on the list right then."
That's
So,
special.
yeah, so it was a thrill, and it's a thrill to go down there and all the events. And then it came around again 14, 13 years later. Yeah.
Well, good things come back around to those who deserve them. And for our listeners out there, you can't see Rick's face kind of lighting up. I can see he's getting excited just thinking about it. So giving you the full sensory experience here for all our listeners. That I can tell Rick is very excited talking about these, and I can understand how meaningful they are to get those nominations. So congratulations and kudos to you.
Yeah.
Now, switching gears a little bit, why don't you talk to us about some of the greatest challenges or a greatest challenge you faced as a documentarian? Anything from funding and distribution to the creative process itself.
I think it's all challenging. Funding is really challenging, and it's the least interesting to talk about. So I'll just toss that one aside. You have to do it. To me, the challenges are realizing your vision, and there's two parts to that. I've been quoted as saying that filmmakers have to be both arrogant and humble. You have to be arrogant enough to think that you have a story to tell to thousands or tens of thousands of people that they haven't heard before. So you're, even if it's something that they heard about before, you have a story about that something that is going to be different than they've experienced. And you have to be humble enough to understand, especially if the story that you're telling or the people that you're interviewing to tell, let's say, a historical story, they're going to be telling something you don't know.
Right.
Or there's going to be events that happen that you haven't foreseen. And your original vision of the beginning, the middle, and the end, you probably had a vision of what the end was. You have to be humble enough to go with your material, to go with the changes. Otherwise, you're going to miss a big picture and it's going to be stale, and likely it's going to be the facts will have outstripped your ability to pursue them. The challenge, once you have an idea and once you start to put it into place and gather all the elements and the people you want to film, is to make the pieces fit. And it is a puzzle. It's a creation. I compared it to like cooking, to recipes and
Yep.
stuff like that. But it's also a puzzle that has to fit together, and it has to be a creation, as any creation, a novel, a song, a poem. It starts at a certain point, and at some point, you decide that it's finished and it's good enough to present to the world.
Absolutely. Now, are there any subjects, you were talking about your vision, are there any subjects or stories that you haven't tackled yet that you would like to explore in a future film or films?
I don't know. I mean, I'm actually moving a little bit towards podcasting. I think there's a lot of ways to tell stories. I think that there's a tremendous opportunities in filmmaking, but there's also things that get in your way.
Sure.
And I think we documentary filmmakers tend to be slave to our visuals that we capture. And the visuals that you capture aren't always the ideal story, parts of the story you want to tell. And with podcasting, with taking away that visual shackles, you might be more free to tell the story that you want to tell. So are there subject matters? I don't know. I take my subject matters from real life right now. I'm working actually on a couple of projects, not filmmaking projects, that have to do with journalism. And we'll see where they go. And we'll see how much time I want to put into this. You introduced me, it kind of shocked me when you said nearly 50 years. Oof. I mean, I've said 40 plus years, but you kind of ramped it up to the next.
But it sounds like you're also adaptable. And as anybody who's in an art profession, as I said, I grew up doing music and theater, and now I'm in marketing. And there's all these kinds of parallels. I think you and I could probably sit here and talk about for hours. I love the cooking parallel. I always used to say that when I worked in felt the same as setting a stage for an opening number. I just think there's so many parallels between art and life and different mediums of art. But for our listeners out there this might be their first exposure to you, how can they find your films? Are they available on any streaming platform other than coming out to the Ner Shalom in Katati and seeing this film? Are there ways they can find their films out there?
Yes. So stripped4partsfilm.com. That's the website where you can go directly to the current film. And if you noodle around there, you can find my other films. The actual literal website is Kovno Communication.
And we'll have those in our show notes as well. So people will
Okay.
be able to click those links and get direct access to them. So you don't have to worry about any
Yeah,
spelling.
so all my films are accessible
Right.
through those websites.
Well, Rick, it's been a pleasure having you on here with us today. For our listeners, please get out there and consider going to see Strip for Parts and hearing the panel over in Katati this week. And coming up, I think Rick might be fine. You might find him on a different podcast near you in the not too distant future. I want to say thank you, Rick. If there's anything else you want to add before we sign off here, that's fantastic.
Yes, I do want to add that the film has been being broadcast since October on PBS stations around the country. And what people out there should know, because the broadcasts have mostly happened, it still will be available free on-demand streaming from pbs.org or the PBS app till the end of the month, and even behind the paywall starting in January, the Passport. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Rick. This was a great conversation, and I look forward to coming out to Katati.
It's sure to be a great Q&A discussion. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I look forward to that. And thank you so much for chatting with me on This Must Be the Place.
My pleasure. I loved your questions, and I love talking about my work.
Good man. Cheers.
Ciao.
The interviews are done, which means I think it's time to crack one open. Interviews make me thirsty, and I want you thirsting for knowledge about some great beer, both local and not so local. Each week, I'll introduce you to a beer I find discussion-worthy and explain the nuances of what makes it fantastic in my eyes and why you should give it a try. And just to keep it on point, I'll even try to make sure the beer reflects the vibe or theme of the episode. The new year has been rung in, and typically this time of year is when people use the slower pace of the month to reflect, and also in some cases abstain from alcohol. Dry January has been of growing popularity over the last few years, especially with the emergence of some non-alcoholic or NA brands that actually have their alcohol-free beer, well, tasting like beer. You're getting companies making NA beer styles that range from IPAs and Pilsners to dark beers and even sours. I thought for the first episode of the new year, I'd sit back with a non-alcoholic beer and share my findings with you from an NA company that was born in Northern California, and that is Best Day Brewing Company. Their ethos is that it's beer for the fun-loving, hard-charging, adventure-seeking, thirsty souls for whom good is just not good enough. Founded just about 5 years ago, they've been growing in presence, and I cracked open a can of their West Coast IPA, a beer brewed on one of the foundational sea hops, Cascade. There's that classic bitterness you need from an IPA to keep quenching your thirst, but with a little less body and more sweetness than I'd necessarily want. But I found that sweet profile true of many NA beers I've tried, and it could just be a personal palate thing for myself. You can find Best Day beers pretty far and wide, from Whole Foods to Oliver's to Community Market, and they have a ton of different offerings. You can even have them shipped to your doorstep. So if you're looking for a way to have your best day yet this January, your host encourages you to give this NA beer company a try. A huge thank you to Rick Goldsmith for appearing on This Must Be the Place this week with me. I'm your host, Alo Galinsky, saying Happy New Year and have a great week. This Must Be the Place is produced by our friends at Pod Locally, an audio platform helping local voices connect to their communities. Don't forget to like, subscribe, or comment on all your favorite podcast apps, and visit the show notes for more information, links, and resources. Look out for our next drop on Sunday. Until then, I'm your host, Alo Galinsky, saying have a great week.